And good morning, shipmates. How are you feeling?
Oh, a little sick.
Well, the old saying is, it rolls at sea, therefore I roll on land. So when you get home, you will walk a, a path to your door and say, I remember the sea off of Namibia. And of course, what's happening where we are is we've now entered the coastal current, which is a cold current from the Southern Ocean off of South Africa that comes up this coast of Western Africa and creates an unusual combination of cold water in the sea and a very arid inland. And they meet at this coast that's been dubbed the skeleton coast for all the skeletons that took a vacation there. And so it means we have a bit of rough weather, and as we go down to Cape Town, it can be fairly placid seas, but you'll feel the giant swell of the Southern Ocean. And the Southern Ocean is the one that goes all the way around Antarctica from west to east, past Cape Horn, Cape Hope, and around south of Australia. But it is famously the roaring 40s and the furious 50s, and so the sea gets bigger because it has no land to block it, and it just goes around the planet and creates these swells that we'll feel as we go further south, and the cold water that comes up and makes a very nourishing marine life, and why there's a great deal of marine life right on this otherwise desert coast. And so I'll just show you some of it. We've already had a bit of taste of it in Namibia, Angola, which has this border that separates Namibia and Angola that was created by the Europeans. But for the local people, they wander through the desert and go up and down the coast, and it's all sort of one area. As you can see, we're coming down, and that white strip is the desert down to Namibia, from Angola down, and then it gets lush again down in South Africa. So that this is an area that, if you've ever been to Peru, Chile, the Atacama Desert, it's very similar. A Southern Ocean cold current brings up cold water and it meets the mountain air and it creates this very arid place. The Namibian desert is like the Atacama, gets almost no perceptible rainfall, and then on the inland has a desolate savanna on the interior. So we'll be coming down here. That's actually Wallace Bay right there. But you can see sort of this great stretch of sand dunes. You can see it from space even. And that's what's so dramatic about this part of the world. Now this is a false coloring. You look at all that green coastline. That's actually elevation. That's not golf courses yet. And on the interior you have, like Angola, you have high plateaus up to almost 3,000 meters. Some 9,000 foot peaks here and there, but it's no great mountain range. It's more of a rolling plateaus up in there. I'll show you some pictures of it. And then it was settled by people in ancient history or prehistory. So the people of this area go back 100,000 years. They go back into the ancestry of us all, actually. But all of the names you see here, Windhoek, the capital, Wallace Bay, where we're going, and Ludwitz is further down there, were the naming of these places by the Portuguese, the Afrikaan, the Germans, and then now English is the most commonly shared language, I'd call it, in Namibia, where there are about 20 other languages which are indigenous. So just for the road map, you can see we're coming to Wallace Bay here, and then there's one road into the capital here, and Ludwitz here. It's very sparse. There are only about 2.5 million people in the whole country, and this again is the size of France. So it's a vast area which is very sparsely populated, and the different groups have interior reserves and then villages and subsistence living for many people in the back country. And this is what it looks like with these sort of strange cactus-like trees and bush and sage and things that remind me of my homeland in New Mexico. And then for the wildlife, this is the most adorable of all, the pangolin, which is the armored armadillo, we call it in the West. And it rolls up in a ball. It's the only animal, when you threaten it, it'll turn into a football. I mean, a soccer ball. You kick it around a bit. And of course, it's endangered because it's considered a delicacy and a medicinal thing for some people, but they're now protected, but they're still hunted. And then you might run into these very adorable wild African dogs. Careful, they're not looking for dog chow, they're looking at you. And then we have, of course, the leopards and cheetahs and different. Now, the game life in Namibia is very few and far between. There are very distant waterholes and cave-like places, like we went in the Arks yesterday, so that most of the game watching and big preserves are in East Africa and South Africa, just because Namibia is so big and so arid that there's very little in the way of big herds or migratory spectacles like on the Serengeti. Well, here's some of our striped friends, which are in eastern toward the border with Botswana. But one thing they do have are wild horses, what we call mustangs. And so these are along the coast and inland. And they are the inheritance of ones that escaped the Europeans when they brought them down for work animals. And then there are wildebeest. And I'm not going to talk too much about the wildlife, just because you can see plenty of features and detail about it. The rhinoceros and the great elephants. Now, elephants are a very adaptable species. They live in the forest, they live in the desert, and only in Namibia do they actually go down to the sea and take a bath, which, if I was an elephant, that's what I'd want to do. So here they are migratory through the desert to go down to the beach for their daily constitutional wellness, they call it in elephant language. And then remarkably, people have been living here again since time immemorial and adapted to the rather difficult conditions, and they have domesticated a version of the, we call it a cattle or a cow, but it's mainly derived from wildebeest and other species in the wild. But the Nana are one of the groups after which Namibia is named, and they're up again in Angola, and they have subsistence agriculture, and then they have cattle herding. This is the Nunyi, which has these fantastic horns and are fairly docile and able to forage even on the edge of the desert. What's happened in Namibia over the centuries is that European farmers have come in and set up ranching operations where there's enough fodder for the cattle, in addition to the migratory patterns of the indigenous people. So here's a guy playing the ram's horn. I think that's a Namibian shofar. Happy Hanukkah, by the way. And then the Herero, they're the largest group of the groups of people, about 20 different groups in Namibia. And these are the remnant of a larger population that had a war between the Nana and then with the German occupation. So they're much diminished in numbers at this point, but you can still see them in northeastern Namibia in the towns, and maybe you'll see them a few in Wallis Bay, though they're inland people, but they have these fantastic elaborate ceremonial dresses, but the women are famous for having a headdress which is constructed with wood and sometimes bone, and this is, unfortunately, it's been written that this is an honorific, that the more the status of the woman, the larger her horns get, as if she was one of the cattle. But anyway, they're beautiful people. You'll see them around. They're very proud of their heritage and their dress, and we've seen a few of them already. But of course, the kids get dressed in leftover teenagers and T-shirts and flip-flops and things that they get sent to them. But there are still the pride of the indigenous artwear and their dress. This is the San people who have been referred to in English as the bush people, the bushmen. They live out in the most arid parts of the Kalahari Desert down into South Africa, and are considered some of the most ancient of all of the African people living in this area since the time began. And they have that kind of distinctive flat face and a kind of a special look to them, so you can see them, very fine hair also. But we saw some Himba yesterday, and so this is always are people really that well dressed in the desert? Well, and our guest was saying when you went to the village, you were sort of taken aback by the pride of the people, and particularly the women who put mud in their hair and rub their skin with this red ochre, and then are very animated and also happy to see us too if they can't quite understand why we are so overdressed. And these headdresses and things are remain. And the question was, are they putting this on for the show? Well, there are very few of us who visit very rarely, and particularly when you get in the backcountry, they probably have never seen anybody other than their own people. So this is the real people living a life that they've somehow maintained for how many millennia. Mostly they're nomadic. They'll go up into the highlands in the rainy season, come down in the lowlands in the dry season. So they're both agriculture and, again, herders and living on subsistence. But they're very resilient, and they've endured longer than those other tribes called the Portuguese or other people who have their own curious indigenous customs. But they live in what we would call utter poverty, but they don't see it that way. They say, well, at least I don't have an internet bill or electrical charge. So this is just something of Namibia. And you go all around Africa, there are so many varieties of people that sort of the great array of humanity can be seen in all parts of Africa. Well, then the Europeans came. This is 1485 when Diego Sao came and placed what's called a pedrada, the cross of the church and the authority of the Portuguese Empire there. They are still along the coast, so they have to be repaired after storms or passage of time. So this is in Diaz Point near Ludovitz, further south, but these are maintained as historical monuments because when the Europeans came, they drew the coast and they sort of said, well, there's something we've heard about places in the interior, but this is completely fictional in the sense of what the local people and how they describe themselves. So I'm not sure what Mano Matape is. But of course, we're going down to Cape Town right then and there. And that was the great surprise for the Portuguese, is that they could get around the tip of Africa against the rough sea and the wind. And it was Vasco da Gama, of course, you know, who finally made the trip all the way to India. But the name of the cape was originally the Cape of Storms. And when Diaz, the explorer, came down this coast, went back to Portugal, King Manuel said, well, you better call it something different. Call it Cape of Good Hope. Maybe you'll survive. And so that's the name that stuck. And meanwhile, the competition between all of the European powers was pretty intense, particularly as the great carving up of the continent happened in the late 1800s. And the German Empire under Bismarck wanted to get a piece of West Africa, in addition to what's now Tanzania, used to be a German colony also. And so the Portuguese cooperated and encouraged the Germans to come and make settlements here to keep the British from taking over all of South and Central Africa. So they set up their original station at Wallis Bay and at Ludovitz, where there's a good harbor, and named it the German Protectorate under the League of Nations. It continued that name. It was eventually, after World War I, given to South Africa to administer. But you can see all these little islands called the Penguin Islands. There's a whole string of them just offshore that are full of penguins. And so the British Navy held the islands while the German Army held the land. And there were a few conflicts during World War I, but it was so far away and so few and far between, it didn't really make much news until there was a big rebellion of the native people, the Nana and the Hiba and the Herero. And the German colonial forces allied with the Nana versus the Herero, and they had a sort of a general civil war, guerrilla war all through Namibia, led on the German side by Lothar von Trotha. And that's the German colonial flag, which you don't see much anymore, but they had insurrections and strikes and battles, mostly an organized army with native soldiers led by the German officers. But they would go in and, let's say, make peace with the natives who didn't want it that way. This is while they're also setting up ranches and farms. To this day, there's about 0.2% ownership of 75% land, mostly by white South Africans who settled into the lush valleys that are quite a way inland. Well, this is one of those little colonial wars which is regretted in hindsight, and all the people who died, particularly the resisting indigenous groups, were rounded up and put in camps and put on reservations, and a lot of them were starved or executed. So this was one of the great colonial crimes of the past, just like in Belgium, and then it reminds me of the American West, where eventually the Indian wars put all of them on reservations, those that had survived. In Namibia, they gave homelands some autonomy, but they cleared the rest of the land for mining and farming, or it's just depopulated by this war. And most infamous in Ludovitz, there's a Shark Island where the political prisoners or war prisoners were there, and then they would be fed to the sharks. And the resistance went on with SWAPO, the Southwest African Liberation Group, who again were made of mixed ethnic groups, but they fought the South African Army. And this only ended when the UN and pressure from other African countries gave Namibia its independence. But it would the South African Army only gave up Wallis Bay in 1994. So this is fairly recent history, where the SWAPO groups of Marxist, revolutionaries, and also guerrilla warfare, like in Angola, finally overcame the resistance, mainly from the South African Army. And then they set up a democratic government, and now they have gone through a couple of cycles of elections. So this was the founder of the country, President Nujoma, who just recently died, one of the founding fathers of this country. But he famously made a deal with both of South Africa to give Namibia independence and aid to help it develop, and we'll see how it has when we visit there. So this is Nujoma on his victory entry into Windhoek, the capital. Now they've just elected Madame Netumbo as the new president of Namibia. So now it's a proud new country. I mean, it's not even 30 years old, really. And so they are amazed that they have their own, let's say, democratic government, a peaceful country, a little bit of a military, that they have any enemy is mostly imaginary because everything's so far away at this point. But as other countries, they take pride in their football, and they're also a very multilingual country. Now, there are all these indigenous languages, but then you have Afrikaans and English and German, and my favorite is no piddle, keine piddlin, pinkney, etc. So everybody speaks a few languages, but you'll see in Wallis Bay, English is pretty pervasive just because there are many people from many places. So we'll be coming in this rather broad bay and to an industrial dock, and then the town just spreads a few blocks in before it becomes the great interior desert. And so the reason why this town is here, because it was a whaling center back 100 or more years ago. And the Wallis Bay literally means the Bay of Whales. So there's some fishing industry still out of here, but nowadays the real business is, like in Angola, petroleum. And so you'll see as we go down, there are all kinds of big offshore rigs and service for the oil industry. And this has made Wallis Bay a fairly modestly prosperous place for the local people who come and work on this, or the other economy of shopping and education. The government center is further inland at Windhoek, but I took these pictures of people's yards where they all have these fantastic succulents. And this is the gift of botany to the world, is all these desert plants that are so hardy and unusual. You probably have one on your kitchen window because they live forever. And when you go into town, you get sort of urban areas that are all low, building like this. But I was interested. This one said, "Beware of the dog." The one next door said, "Trespassers will be eaten." So the dogs rule as usual. And it's not very interesting except for, it's just curious, this town. There's no great monuments or anything. And you can go around and see the newly built shopping centers and things like that. And again, it's an example where there's a prosperity in certain places in Africa and even Namibia where people come and they have employment in a whole new community, wherever they came from. But they have some pretty funny shop offerings. You can buy a used airplane if you like. And I hope then the other, where we go, is this town, which is just to the north of Wallis Bay. So there's an excursion there to Swakopmund, which again was a German town based on fishing and mining. And we go up there because it sort of turned into a resort area also. But I believe the tour may go to what's called Mandresa, which is one of these very large refugee camps. I would call by choice, because people from the interior come and they're allowed, there's a big piece of land where they're allowed to build a little house. And so they have now been there for generations. There are, I think, 30, 40,000 people in this sort of a shanty town. And so they'll paste together a house and they'll go to work in the town. And so it's an example of those who are either driven to the towns or want to immigrate to the towns just for work. And so eventually they'll move into a bigger house or have a more comfortable accommodations. For instance, they don't have any electricity or running water, one of those things you get used to after a while. And here's one sign that I saw when we were visiting there last time. One day God will make you smile over the things that made you cry, which is from Isaiah. And we went to a luncheon there, which was all desert food, which sounds very tasty. They don't serve it on here, but wild greens, wild birds, and millet gruel, and Coca-Cola. But then the servers came and gave us a bit of a song. These are the wildlife section. So each one impersonates a wild animal in that section. Well, we are not going to the next port of Namibia, but I'm going to show it to you anyway because it's a particularly beautiful, curious design town from the German era. I believe Ludowitz is a town in Germany. Anybody can confirm that. But this was, again, a port and mainly served the mining interest inland. There's quite a bit of diamond and, to this day, uranium, tin, and other valuable mining operations further in, but people preferred to live by the shore and the port and such. And this was built with the period German architecture. So you have the concert hall, the Lutheran church, and the railroad owner of the inland mining built that little summer cottage up there. But it all has been preserved as a national monument. In spite of the resentments of whatever happened in history, they take pride in the fact they have all these beautiful buildings that had never been seen in this part of Africa before. And particularly the house of a mining family says, Glück auf, good luck out there. And this is the Görke house, which is the sort of the mansion overlooking the town with a beautiful view. And so we don't have time to stop there this time, but so I show it to you anyway in case you want to come back, and particularly to the World Championship of Sail Racing, which there's a big lagoon that has miles of flat water that are protected from the ocean swells, and the steady wind you'll feel, constant southwest wind, and that's where the world records are set in this kind of competitive sport. But of course they don't have a buffet aboard that ship. And then the capital of Windhoek, which means the windy hill in Afrikaans, and that's become the capital and the financial center for the whole nation. And it's has some interest, but it's mainly just a a more benign climate over there because it's not this wind and it's not so full of sandstorms, things you get on the coast. And so now the government is in the old German Tinten Palace, and this is a monument to one of the Herero fighters of the time, and the hero's acre, a memorial, and a graveyard for the recently finished Civil War. But when you go out of these towns, the country just spreads as far as you can go into scenes like this. Well, we went out yesterday to see the desert in Angola, in Namibia, so it's very familiar, this vast sort of flat desert plains, and then it gets into bushland with more foliage and some farming, and then it comes up into the plateau where these fantastic rock formations are, the Spitzkoppe and other monuments to sedimentary erosion. Where we were yesterday, we saw a lot of this, where the sea had risen up and gotten washed away, leaving fantastical shapes, big cliff ranges. And so inner Namibia is a four-wheel drive and expeditionary country. There's no towns for hundreds of miles in many places. But for geologists, it's sort of like a playground because you get these kind of step rocks, the Corishas, and standing boulders and arches. And so this is where miners got distracted by the scenery. But back on the coast, you have this plain that then descends through sand out into the very dry desert is right along the coast. Inland on these valleys, there's enough fodder for some wildlife. So you have some range elephants. There's not really a forest to speak of in the whole country, but they migrate very far to the seasonally, depending on where there's water and fodder for them. This is a local antelope, the gemsbok. There are many kinds of antelope in Africa, of course. So like the springbok in South Africa, this is the bigger one. But they, again, migrate across the sands to a watering hole and have their life fully out into the extent of it without much cover. This is called the Etosha Salt Plain. Curiously, this part of Africa, particularly in Botswana, the coastal plateaus mean that what rain there is makes for rivers that flow into a depression, and that can be wet and full of life in the rainy season, and then it just dries out. So there are very few rivers that flow into the ocean. They flow into the interior, and that's where the wildlife will gather seasonally. So here's one of the dried out salt pans in one of the back ranges of Namibia. So this is pretty inhospitable for life, but nonetheless things somehow happen. I mean, we went out to see the plants out there. Last time I was here, we were hiking in a desert near the shore, and at a distance, I think it's a red fox, but it was all alone, just sitting there looking at us without even getting up. I guess he'd seen the likes of us before, but I haven't yet to identify this variety. It was not in a pack. It was solo. There was nothing for miles around. Then there are lots of little lizards, this chameleon. And this bug, the Namibian desert beetle, is curious because it will open its wings at dawn and it'll gather fog from the sea air and take that in as its supply of water. But if you get near it, this bug is famously fast. It can run so fast, they said if it was a human, it'd be in a sprint to 40 miles an hour right instantly. So it can escape any predator by just scurrying away. Well, this is what we went to see yesterday, if you saw this, the Weltschia, named after a German botanist who first described it. And this is the miracle plant of the Namibian desert. And those of us who saw it, and you might even see it in town because they planted it around, this is a plant that can live for 1,000 or more years. And it has a structure of a very deep woody root that goes down many meters, and then these leaves that sort of loll around. And they look like, the plant looks like it's always dying just because the ends of the leaves are always desiccating and falling off. And then it has the male flower, or the male spores come out of one plant. Sometimes the same plant will have both that and the buds that are the flower itself. Now this is very slow growing, very slow reproducing. It takes a beetle to get on the plant to pollinate the flowers, and often again on the same plant. But this woody structure is it looks like a big rock. But so this is sort of the mysterious plant of all. And it was the model for the man-eating plant in Rocky Horror Show, if I have my cultural history straight. But what happens is the sea air carries moisture, it goes in, it doesn't really rain, it just is a fog, and that is just enough for life to happen out there. And on the shore, often the coast is completely fogged in, depending on the time of year and the weather patterns, but they're mostly this driving wind from the southwest that will, along with the current, drive any vessel that is not underway well enough onto the shore. And so this is the skeleton coast up here, because you have bird life and you have elephants and things come down to it, but otherwise it's almost completely uninhabitable for humans. But there's a lot of marine life off there. Whales originally, they're coming back. Dolphins, a lot of fish life, and then penguins, African penguins that come up from South Africa, and lots of seals and some sea lions even. And they come up and they'll go along the shore right next to what they call the sand sea. And this is where, particularly from above it, you get kind of a feeling of abstraction of natural patterns creating these dunes. Of course, there are other parts of the world like this in Arabia, all, but usually not so dramatically right next to the ocean. Here's the tide coming in on the inlet with all of the sand. And so this is maybe a pretty picture. You wouldn't want to be lost out there. And that's what's happened with shipping, particularly in the days of sail, is a sail vessel will get in near shore and it could not escape the currents, and they would be driven ashore on this kind of scenery with no water, no vegetation, and so that's why it was called a skeleton coast. But it is beautiful, but it's a bit of a trek to get out there. You have to have a four-wheel drive vehicle that can even get near it. And so that's a kind of iconic view of North Namibia. We don't see this right near Wallis Bay, I should say. It's many hours north. But I show it to you just because this is sort of the one end of the world that you do not want to get stuck in, because some didn't make it back for lunch. And people go out there just to see this sort of remains of, particularly the shipping, all up and down the coast. There are hundreds of shipwrecks, sort of like the graveyard of the sea of the African style, not quite Cape Hatteras, but similar. And so this is the legacy of all the people who came here usually to do mining. That was the great lure of Namibia, is to go near enough, and they still have mining dredges, because out of whatever stretch of the beach, the currents stir up diamonds from the seabed that have been washing over the millennia out onto the shore, but it was often at the expense of the ship. So fortunately, Crystal always stays well enough away to we don't get a close look at these sort of things, but I just show it to you because it's deliciously tragic, I would say. But sometimes you get free parking. And here's one of the big mining rigs that was on the shore, mostly for diamonds near the shore. But the other parts of Namibia are famous for many other minerals, and particularly these crystals. And my son Robin, who's an expert in these things, he said, you have to look at these fluorite. It's called this green crystal, which is not phosphorescent. It's just in the light you get this reflection. And so this is a prized collector's gem from Namibia, and particularly a place called Brandenburg. And so with a backlight, you see these faces, and so this has been called the Eye of Africa. And it may not notice that we're here, but then again, some other Namibians are following us wherever we go. So that's just one of the export items of Namibia. Near Wallace Bay, so this sign. The tourism is the new industry. Now that people can fly in or ships coming by. So we hope you'll enjoy your stay and you find the officials courteous. Your cooperation to help them will to be even more so. But to be careful of the customs officials who are too friendly. So now in Wallace Bay, just particularly to the north near the next town up, they started developing seaside resorts. And so there's some modest hotels and houses for people who, particularly from the interior, will have a summer or dry season home on the shore. And now they're building condos and all the rest of the modern conveniences. But it's a pretty far place to go for a round of golf, especially if you have to bring your own grass. So that's what Namibia is becoming, a peaceful country, somewhat prosperous, but we're still with these subsistence people who are living their ancient life, and then they'll come to the casino when they can, perhaps. But they're promoting fishing, though I think they should never catch a shark. You should always let it go. And when I was here last week, that's my wife Barbara, we came across this weather station of the weather rock. If it's wet, it's raining. If the stone is white, you see the stone right there. If it's white, it's snowing. If it's swinging, it's windy. If it's lying on the ground, the rope has broken. If it's gone, there's been a tornado or somebody stole it. Now this is going to be the new weather station for the United States pretty soon, too. But other tourists come to learn surfing the hard way. And so that's the charm of Namibia. And I show this picture because, not because the metaphor of the ostrich ignores bad news and sticks their head in the sand. Well, it's actually because they'll have an egg that they'll partly bury, and so it won't get too hot in the midday sun. And so the females and the male will go turn the egg and keep it covered with sand so it's okay in the day. And so people thought, well, the ostriches are sticking their head in the sand. Well, they're actually tending to their egg. But it reminds me of the story of two female ostriches are walking across the plains, and they notice up on the hill a couple of males are looking at them and start coming their way. And so the female said, let's go this way. And they see that the males are coming closer to them, and they start to say, well, we've got to get out of here because we don't want to socialize with these kind of guys. So they start running, and the males keep running and catch up close. And so the two females say, well, now we just got to hide, and they stick their head in the sand. And the two males come running up next to them and say, where'd they go? Where'd they go? Well, with that, I wish you a good trip to Namibia, and keep your head above the sand. Thank you very much. Thank you.